Anytime I'll find a rap conversation, it's a quote for rap.
Welcome everyone to the final of Human Debates 2011. Congratulations to all the teams involved. This debate will include the team in opening government from Portland, in open opposition, St. John, in closing government, Cornell v. Wine, closing opposition, Cornell SR. Judging will be myself, Dan Hubman, Isaac Lowe, Jess Bullard, Paul Gross, and timing will be Dylan Saylor. You just come to the
What's that? My fault.
Okay, and the motion is this House believes that black comedians, musicians, and other public figures should not use the N-word. I'd like to welcome the Prime Minister to open the case. Stands in his name.
I am a brown-haired, blue-eyed descendant of Englishmen. My last name is Baker. Ladies and gentlemen, I am the whitest participant in this debate round. I think at the very least, I can do the black community the service of speaking about this debate round from their perspective. I think what we ought to be talking about, or at least what I'm going to talk about in my little corner of the debate, is whether or not the use of the N-word, and out of respect for the people who I'm asking to make this commitment, I also choose not to say the word we're all discussing. I think that I'm going to talk about whether or not the use of this word is good for the black community in and of itself, and good for individual members of the black community, because these are the people we're asking to make the commitment to reject the use of this word in today's debate round. So that's just where I'm coming from. I want to talk about three things. First of all, I'm going to talk about the critical importance of culture, and why using words in a culture has incredible influence on a group of people or on a society. Second, I'm going to talk about how this word is incredibly powerful, and it represents a victim, a narrative of victimhood, rather than an aspirative narrative that has incredibly detrimental influence on the black community. And third of all, I'm going to talk about how it represents an arbitrary standard that's used to oppress individual members of the community, especially marginalized members of the community. We'll get on to that in just a second. Let's first of all talk about the critical importance of culture. On side opening government, we think there's a reason why every culture, every society that we've ever encountered in all of history or in all of the present day tells stories about itself. And that's fundamentally what we think the role of actors and musicians and comedians are. Comedians criticize a society from within by mocking it gently to get it to adapt its behavior. Musicians and actors both tell stories, both in their own way. And we think that these are the means through which we communicate our shared cultural values. Now, this isn't anything so brute and so simple as saying hip-hop causes violence because hip-hop artists depict violence. Instead, it's a discussion of how we view ourselves and how we view our society, and how we ought to view ourselves and how we ought to view our society. And we think that when a person who's in this incredible position of power in a society, and over the people who look up to them, chooses to or not to use a word, it has an incredible influence on individual decisions. We hope side opposition is okay with that in today's debate. Go ahead.
If culture is so important, like you say, what problem does your side have with allowing a culture to determine every aspect of how it constitutes itself? I'm
not forcing anyone to do anything. I'm appealing to these people to say it's not good to depict your own culture in this way? That's the question of this debate. Is it good for the black community? This isn't a debate about compulsion, it's a debate about whether or not those aspects are positive or negative. Because fundamentally, ladies and gentlemen, culture, part of the discussion that culture engenders is whether or not the culture we presently have is good for us at the present time. And part of culture is the renegotiation of culture when we think it's having a negative, detrimental influence on us as members of that society. And so that's what I'm talking about in my second point, why we think it is detrimental, and why therefore we think it ought to be renegotiated and ought to be pushed back against by people in this position of power, the storytellers of the black community. Second, the N-word is not a harmless word. My partner is going to talk about how reclaiming words is not a project that's worth pursuing. It's not a project that helps us in any way. But we think the black community has, the N-word harkens back to the days of slavery. It harkens back to a fundamental power imbalance between certain members of that society. And we recognize that the power imbalance exists to the present day, right? We recognize economic inequality. We recognize oppression of black communities. We don't think that recognizing the fact that one is still not equal in one's own society is bad. But we can construct narratives, ladies and gentlemen, that aren't true. We think that a narrative is not necessarily what facts one recognizes about the world, but how one chooses to view one's own response to those facts. And we think that since the N-word is fundamentally reliant on a narrative of victimhood, a narrative of power imbalance, it re-entrenches that narrative. And we ought to think about ourselves not in terms of how we are dispossessed and how we are victims, but rather what we aspire to and what we struggle for. Because, ladies and gentlemen, everyone faces setbacks. Many people more than others. But rather than simply talking constantly about our setbacks, we think the black community has a much stronger interest in defining what it positively strives for through the language that it chooses to reject, through the language that harkens back only to the days of slavery and only to the days of basic political inequality. Go ahead, open it.
It's not only the days of slavery, it's today. That oppression is still being faced, and we need to be reminded of it, that it wasn't just the plantation, it's every day.
I said that. I recognize that. That's true. The question is not what is going on now, it's what is the basic value of my community and in what direction does my community want to move in? That's the narrative question that we have to answer. So finally, I'm going to talk not just about narrative. This is not simply like an abstract discussion. This does have incredible harms on members of this community. We think that defining one's own narrative in terms of victimhood rather than in terms of aspiration has a negative effect on your desire to succeed in that society. You tend to view, it's called locus of control in psychology, right? When you have an external locus of control, you tend to view your failures as not your own and your successes as also not yours. But when you have an internal locus of control, you tend to view your failures and the successes as generated by yourself. And what's important about that is not that it's true or not true, but that people with an internal locus of control work harder because they think they're responsible for their own decisions and they struggle against the circumstances they've been put in rather than passively accept them. Lastly, let's talk about the arbitrary standard that this creates. Because race is not a biological fact. It's a social construct. And who gets to say the N-word is like a chip that can be used to oppress people who you don't want to see as a part of your community. There are basically no people in the United States who've been here for more than 100 years, or whose families have been here more than 100 years, who are either completely European or completely African. The boundaries are shifting. They don't exist, ladies and gentlemen. And we think that what happens is people of mixed race, basically everyone is of mixed race, but some people look black and some people don't. People of mixed race don't get to say the word because they're not fundamentally viewed as members of this community. Prejudice against mixed-race Americans has been persistent for hundreds and hundreds of years, not just from the white community, but from the black community as well. And we think that saying who gets to use the N-word and who gets to say that, regardless of the consonants and vowels that it possesses at the end, is a power that can be wielded to oppress people who you don't want to see as part of a community. And rather than defining our community in terms of narrow barriers that don't actually exist and don't make any sense, it ought to be based on a definition of fundamental values, and a definition of community values, and of inclusivity for all. And we're very proud to begin today's debate.
I thank the speaker very much for his speech and welcome the Leader of the Opposition to open the case for St. John's.
privilege too. But I'm a nigger who's in college. I'm a nigger who's getting an education. I'm a nigger who's had a job. I'm a nigger whose parents own land. We think that all of these things are drastically important because we think that the word nigger is not just about something that was static, not just something that died in the 1960s with the Civil Rights Amendment. We think it's something that shows a transformative narrative. And we think that the power of the word comes from the people who use it and what they determine to use it as and what they see their symbol and their culture as. And we think that the black community can use this word, especially those who hold positions of power. I need to do a little bit of rebuttal. We heard that, I'm going to go backwards in backwards order from what he said, right? He said, like, this is a bad word to use because, like, those who look black get to use it and those who don't get to use it. Okay, I'm going to make a declaration to side government today. If you want to ask me a POI, you can only refer to me as my nigger, otherwise I won't take it. We think that it's a good word for every person to use because we think that we can empower not just black people to use it, but white people as well. But then we heard, like, the power of the word, like, it has this narrative of victimhood. We say no, because we think that it's not just about victimhood, but it's about self-empowerment also. Because I can come up here and say that I'm a nigger, and I'm in the finals of a debate, in the finals of a very competitive debate tournament, and that I'm an articulate person, I can read, and I can do all these other things, right? But then we heard, like, what about the basic value of a community? We say that the basic value of a community is one that can show you that I am what you labeled me, but I am not what you intended it to be to me, right? Because we say that the worst aspect of racism, the worst aspect of slavery, was the social lie that was told to African Americans, that you are less than the other person, that you can't read, you can't write, that you are somehow, because of your race, intrinsically less valuable than another. We say that that social lie can finally be overturned when people own this word and show that, yes, I am what you labeled me, but I can read. I can write. I am not less than you. But then we heard about the critical importance of culture. And is that to tell a story, the critical importance of culture is to tell a story about itself. The story that they want the African American community to tell you is one that is whitewashed. One in which that the racial history that they tell you can only be one where I refer to myself as black, right? Because as if the word nigger simply never existed. Or one in which nigger was only used in the past, like in some past context. We say that our racial history and our culture still exists today, and it's one that's transformative. It didn't just leap magically from 1800 to 1850 to 2011, where like everything's better. Because we still think that racial oppression, like we still think that there are racial disparities today. We still think that there are ways for there's a long way for the African American community to grow. But we still think that we've grown a long way, and that we can show that we've grown that way by using the word nigger to show that we aren't what you labeled us. Okay, so what we want to talk to you about is why using the word nigger takes the power away from the negative connotation. No, you know the rule, right? We say that the importance of this, especially with the public figure, it means that the word nigger is no longer something that is completely negative. We say that especially when public figures use this word, it means that the negative connotation, the insult has been taken away. The word will no longer have the same power. Why? Because I am now embracing this role as somebody who's not like this poor, destitute slave. Especially with public figures. Because we say that these are the ones in positions of power. We say that Jay-Z now has a net worth of around $500 million. And then when he says the word nigger, he's showing that, yes, black people can achieve this type of success. And not only can they achieve this type of success, they can achieve it in ways and go through different struggles that not everybody else did. That is the importance of the word. It shows you that you can come out of a situation that not everybody else in the community did. We don't think that success is something that should be homogenized to something that shows that everybody comes at it from this static situation. We think that it should be we think that it should show that people can come out of different situations. We say that when you use the word nigger, that empowers that. We say that when you use the word nigger, it empowers that. Furthermore, we would tell you that like Franz Fanon in his book Black Skin, White Mask writes about the Negro of the Antilles. He tells you about the struggle that he goes through. He tells you about the constant inferiority complex that the Negro of the Antilles goes through because he's always defining himself by how white that he can be. He's always defining his success based in terms of whiteness. He can only be successful in a white culture. We tell you that the word nigger means, and especially when it's used by public officials or public figures, means that you can now define yourself in terms of blackness, in terms of your niggerhood if you want to. We say that this is a great thing for people to have because it shows you that you can can now compare yourself to other successful niggers out there. And it's not something that's bad, it's something that's damn good. Because P. Diddy's a nigger too, Jay-Z's a nigger too, Oprah's a nigger, and combined they'd have a net worth of over $2 billion. But then what we'd also tell you, right, is that like oftentimes these public officials, what they're asking you to do by using the word nigger, it's not just saying like, oh, it's not this destitute thing. You know the rule too, Ryan, right? It's not just this destitute thing about like, oh, like you're poor or anything like that. What they say, like, if you listen to Jay-Z's like Watch the Throne, he's like, put some colored girls in the MoMA. He asked Walt Disney to put like color in his cartoons. Why? Because for too long they have told us our history. There's been like one black princess that came out in 2010 or 2009 with whatever that movie is, right? There's also like, there've been like for too long, throughout the social life that they told us, they not only dictated what we were, they told us what our history was, they told us what we were in the present. We say that now, we're not going to let them define us define our future for us. That it's time that we define a future for ourselves, and we define it through using the word nigger to show the prospects of the nigger, to show it what he can be, right? But then we'd also tell you that like we need to manufacture these monuments through our language, a monument a monument of our past, right? Because we say that it's very hard for people to deny the Holocaust because there are monuments and Auschwitz still exists. You can go there and you can visit it, right? You know what's happened. You can never deny that. With racism, you cannot deny that because it happened everywhere. There was no one burning flag that happened in any city that said, this is the mark of racism as per with Auschwitz. But the word still exists, and that is the one remnant that we still have. So we can define this monument and erect this monument through the language that we use to show that yes, racism existed. Racism still exists within our society. We can define ourselves by this word, but we don't have to be what they intended it to be. We can be what we want it to be. And because of all these reasons, Tim and I are very proud to apply.
If you notice what happened in this debate round, Baker and I made a decision together that we weren't going to ask a POI. And although the bottom half tried to make a POI, they were fundamentally rejected in doing it because of their refusal to engage in what we think is the fundamental problem. I think this is a demonstration of exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about. It creates this idea of otherness, that somehow, because you are black or you have darker skin, you're different than somebody else. That's what we're trying to avoid on government today. We're trying to make a society more inclusive. And that's what happens when, like, Baker gets up here and he explains about these, like, what happens when some people can use the word and others can't use the word. Because that's true. I don't feel comfortable standing up and being forced to use a negative word like that. And I don't think that forcing me to do it necessarily creates any kind of social change that's positive. Before I move on to my positive matter, which I will talk a lot about, the idea of reclaiming the word, right? Because I feel that words have context, or words have meaning based upon their context, right? So it doesn't matter, you can never actually reclaim a word. But I'll get there, because I think it clashes well with what he had to say, which was most of the substantive matter he talked about. But he did say something interesting at the end of his speech. He talked about this idea of remembrance, right? Creating monuments through language and stuff. I think largely that's what Baker brought to. That was the whole reason that we're targeting comedians, we're targeting actors, we're targeting museums. Because we do need to keep the storytelling going on in our society, right? We do need to make sure that these oppressive stories are told. And the people in our society today who hold the power to do that are comedians. They are actors. They are storytellers, right? So the best way to do this remembrance thing is in a respectful way by not using offensive words, etc., etc., etc. Furthermore, they didn't address the idea of otherness that Baker brought to you, right? That was it was at the end of his speech, so I guess I'll give him a little thing. But the problem is, there's no objective way to figure out who can and who can't use the word. It's arbitrary. It's a socially arbitrary created standard. And we feel that no matter where you draw the line, there will always be somebody who is outside of the in-group. who can't use the word, who feel uncomfortable using the word, right? And this creates a problem not only within the black community, but in mixed race communities and other communities that don't have any blackness in them, right? Because of the power of the word. But I'm going to get on to what my positive matter here about context. Because the attempt to recapture words has happened before, right? I want to use specifically the queer community. Because the historical word queer used to be derogatory. People used to say it, you're a queer, right? You were bad. That's negative connotation. So the queer community got together and tried to reclaim the word queer, which means I can say it now, kind of, sort of, without the negative connotation, right? You have queer pride parades, etc., etc. But the problem is, when a man across the street points at a gay man and says, "You queer!" that still carries with it negative connotation that no matter how much you try to reclaim, you cannot take the negativeness out of that word. Words are simply expressions of human emotion, feelings, and thoughts. And no matter how much as a community you try to reclaim a word, you never get around the fact that all communication is taking an idea in your head and putting it into action. Go ahead.
Here's the problem. When you react to the person who says you're queer and say it's bad for you to normatively use that word, what you're denying him is of the chance to say, I am queer and damn proud of it.
Like, I want that to be the case, right? Like, I really wish we lived in a world where that can happen. But the opposite happens. When the gay man on the opposite side of the corner receives this negative thing, he doesn't go, I'm queer, woo, right? He still feels the negative connotation from that word, no matter how much they reclaim it, right? It's still a negative word. You can't take away that context, right? And it's not just like a really cool, thought experiment I'm going through with, right, too? It has real impactful problems. And so I want to talk a little bit about what I'm going to call social inertia, right? Because that's not just a really cool term I made up in prep, that's actually a thing, right? If you take the aggregate ability of like a community or a group or a society, I'm talking about money, time, energy you have to address a problem, there's only so much you can do, right? So when you spend your time reclaiming a word, you are failing to use this social inertia in the right way. You're wasting your time, basically, right? You don't make meaningful change. We think, go ahead.
There is a department in almost every academy that studies queer studies. You can be a professor of queer studies. Tell me how this is not meaningful change for what the word queer means.
Okay, that's my entire point. The gay community tried so hard to reclaim the word, but they can't take away the negative connotation, no matter how many departments are called like queer department, because the individual using the word is the one who wields the power and wields like the necessary change, right? This directly affects how we can use the comedians and actors, right? Because they are the ones using the words. And when a black comedian or a black musical artist or artist gets in front of a group of people or in front of an arena or in like films like a movie or something like that, it's the context in which that individual person that uses the word, right? Which I would like to point out is almost always negative, right? When a black comedian goes up there and starts using the N-word, it's not because he's trying to empower the black community. It's because he's using that word in a negative context and then and hopefully in a comedic way also, so we laugh at it. We don't think that takes away the power. In fact, we think that wastes the social inertia. These communities should be spending more time affecting and positive change, right? They should be trying to empower their communities. Instead of wasting time reclaiming words, what they should be doing is like going to Washington, right? Marching. They should be collecting monies. They should be trying to effect policy that will really change society, right? These are the efforts that necessarily you can't do as an activist if instead of trying to raise money for your cause or change policy, you're wasting your time talking about words. It's silly. It doesn't actually do anything, and you don't have the positive impact that you want for your community. If you want to enrich your community, then you should go out and actively participate in changing a policy of class indifference, of economic indifference, these kinds of things. Changing a word simply doesn't have any of these impactful effects, because you're wasting the inertia. So because of these reasons, we are proud to stand here and propose the motion. Thank you.
I think the speaker is speaking to call upon the Deputy of the Opposition to close out the first half.
I am not a nigger, and I do not face the same problems that Nelson faced in order to get to this final round. By the nature of the fact that I am a white male, I have certain kinds of privilege to move about in society that Nelson does not have. And I want to talk to you today about whiteness, and how whiteness functions as a rhetorical strategy to continue the oppression of black people. And I will demonstrate this through everything that opening government has said, because they have demonstrated all of the principles of whiteness as a rhetorical strategy. And then I will talk to you about how this helps black communities internationally. So first, what is whiteness as a rhetorical strategy? Young Jeezy has a song called White Girl, which is in response to this very phenomenon, in which when you hear a news report in public discourse that says a woman has been arrested, when it just says woman, it means white. When it's a black woman, it says a black woman has been arrested. Whiteness as a rhetorical strategy means that when you are white, you need no description. And what they have just told you is a similar thing. Oh, people are all just kind of the same now, and things aren't so bad anymore, and we don't want you to seem different because things are the same. We think that when whiteness operates in this way, it is under the principle of erasure. It is trying to erase the memory of a violent oppression that is historical, but also continues today. And we need to address this. So what does erasure look like? It says things like this. Everything that you face, all that violent oppression, happened in the past. And that ignores everything that Nelson just told you. This isn't something that happened in the past, something that happens every day. In the fact that you need to prove your success as if you were a white person. As if I was just another person who was white. Oh, see, now I am just like you. Rather than saying that, it says, no, I have gotten success, though I faced oppression, and my oppression is violence. And the word that I will use to describe myself, being successful underneath that oppression, is nigger. Then they also say things that like, well, everyone faces oppression. This is not true. Everyone does not face oppression. And when people do face oppression, there are different types of oppression. And we should pay attention to these kinds of things. Black individuals face different types of oppression, and different types of oppression in different countries than other kinds of people do, as then working class white people type of oppression that they face. This is not something that ought to be whitewashed. This is something that we ought to remind each other of, the differences of these types of oppressions. And then they're going to tell you something like, oh, well, it otherwise is white people. And it makes white people feel uncomfortable, because we don't want to use the word nigger to ask a POI. You ought to be uncomfortable. You've made black people uncomfortable for a long time when we called them niggers. That's the problem that we are addressing. That when black people are allowed to say, I am a nigger, we are allowed to make white people uncomfortable about that word. That is exactly the power that it has when the black community can use that word to make white people uncomfortable. And then we hear this other thing. Well, here's what you should do. You should address some other problems. This is silly. It's just a word. This is the type of thing that says, well, your problem that you face is not this real problem. The real problem is this other thing, which the white community has decided. This is why the black community should never stop using this word, because they are going to say, it's not just those other problems, it's also this problem. It's the problem that you want us to not remember where we came from. Ryan.
Okay. I'm going to throw you a softball. Do you ultimately want us to get towards a post-racial society?
No! I do not want us to get towards a post-racial society, because that is erasure. That is getting rid of what actually happened. When Elie Wiesel tells us to never forget, what he means is we don't want a society in which the Jew doesn't exist anymore. We don't want a society that, because of some ideal of intermarriage that you're going to come about, or ideals of, oh, race is just a construct, that the Jew won't exist. We think that this is a racist principle. This is not something that we want to stand for. And we want to monumentalize it in language. When we monumentalize something like Auschwitz, it is there. But when the word queer and the word nigger are used, it is because that oppression happened everywhere. It happened for a long time. And so the monument has to be everywhere. It has to be in language to remind us of where that oppression was, where it was located. It was located in language, and that is where it will remain. We shall never forget. Now I want to talk to you about how this affects the international community. Precisely because most of this is in pop culture, and it is mostly American. It affects other black communities that didn't have the civil rights movement to say, we are a black community, we are different. When you are a black in Europe, when you are black in Africa, you don't have those kinds of identities to talk about. I want to talk more about Nelson's example of Front National. In the French Antilles, when they were watching Tarzan, and when Tarzan was beating the savages that were black, they cheered. But then when they went to Paris, and people said, oh, you are black, they realized, oh, we weren't Tarzan, we were black. This is our identity. And so that creates this kind of inferiority complex. In societies where there was not the civil rights movement, and where the discourse of being different, of being a nigger, of being black is not there, pop culture has now made it accessible. We see Northern Africans now saying, I'm a nigger too. We see people in Europe saying, I'm a nigger too. And I will not just be European. I will not just be a black European. I will be totally different from you, and we ought to have the right to do that. We only have access to that right when we can consume popular culture that has that word. Discourse shapes the choices of our lives. This is not a choice we should take away from people who did not have the history of slavery necessarily, or the history of the plantation, where you will remember in your civics courses what MLK said. We think that pop culture is a way to internationalize the phenomenon of being a nigger. We think that is a good thing.
Okay, why should members of communities who have nothing like the American experience of blackness adopt that narrative, adopt the language, just because American pop culture is really powerful?
Because it is a choice in a society that says, you're a black in Paris, you're a black in Berlin. So here's how you can succeed. By doing all the things that white people do. By going to university, by getting a good job. But even though you face that same kind of oppression, you don't have a discourse to appeal to that says, actually I am different. But now, when you can listen to Young Jeezy, when you can listen to Waka Flocka, when you can say Jay-Z, and this is the type of music I listen to, and this is how I dress, and guess what? It makes me a nigger. Then you don't think that people in Paris can respond to you in the same way. They can't say, hey Trump, how's it going? Because you faced a lot more to get there than they did. And that's something that people ought to remember. Not just saying, when black people, through the great deal of oppression, emerge into a part of society that they would not otherwise be, that it's just good for you. Glad you're here, but let's not talk anymore about it. It's, I will remind you every day what I faced to get here. We think this is the best principle. This is a good principle to allow that type of freedom, that lifestyle choice for people in other countries that don't have this history. We think that when they talk about how the word queer is used, you shout queer at someone, there's always going to be this negative connotation. But when public officials use it, it does actually change the nature of how that word operates in public discourse. True, people can still use this word as an insult, but you can say, yes, actually, I am queer. And we mean different things by that. And that's okay, because I'm going to the university, and I am a professor of queer studies. And we also think that if people want to use the word nigger in a violent way, we think that public officials change the word in the same way, because now people can adopt it. And we also think that people are less likely to use it in a violent way, because that meaning of the word is changing. For all of these reasons, we are proud.
I thank the speaker very much for his speech, and I call upon the first speaker from Cornell, BY, to open the case for the second half.
If you want to ask me a POI, you can only refer to me as the Big Red Bear. Cornell. What we just heard from opposition was a great argument for why we should have good, reasoned, intellectual discussions about race. It is not an argument for Waka Flocka Flame playing in the paint, right, over and over and over again, and using the word in a way that is inherently derogatory, right? That is not what's being brought up. All we talk about is we need to use this word, we need to remember repression going forward. But we haven't even gotten an impact about how that's good, right? What we're going to talk about is the negative impact of these stereotypes, of constantly reminding people of this oppression going forward, right? We think, first of all, that the N-word is a negative word, but even if it's good, we're going to say, even if it's reclaimed, we're going to say that that hurts society. But before we do that, I want to have some specific rebuttal, right? We're told by Nelson in the first speech that it won't be a negative word if it's constantly used. It's constantly used now, and it's still a negative word. This is just false, right? Then we're told that the Holocaust you can remember because Auschwitz is still there, so no one can deny it, right? But racism you can't see, and so it is denied. But then he tells us it constantly exists today, right? People see racism all the time, whether or not a black comedian says the N-word. That is not the appearance of racism. The appearance of racism is seeing that there are less African Americans in college. Yes, that's what's going on. That's the example of racism being out, right? Then we have this example of how it's when a white person is killed, it's a woman, and when a black person is killed, it's a black woman, right? And we think that's the exact problem. We think that's bad because we think that more and more African Americans' primary definition is that they are black, right? Is that we are treating them as a homogenous group where everyone is always fighting against this thing, and their primary trait is black. And many African Americans African-American community don't want to be defined by their primary trait of black, and don't want the N-word to be how everyone looks at them, and we're standing up for those people too, right? Then we're told a post-racial society is bad, right? A post-racial society is not one that we have forgotten about slavery or we have forgotten about history, but it's not the primary way in which people interact with each other. It's not the fact that the first thing I notice about you is your race, and the way I interact with you changes because of your race. I can still be knowledgeable about slavery, I'm just not being racist explicitly or implicitly in how I do it. And then we say that people are united by the word, right? We'd say that people aren't united by the word, that it's very divisive. That is not something that the African American community embraces wholeheartedly. But second of all, why should we unite them behind the history of African Americans in slavery? Why should that be the primary trait that defines African Americans, right? We think that these stereotypes are bad. We're going into positive matter now. We think these stereotypes are bad. We think this constant impact and reminding is bad, and we're going to talk about that more, right? We think it's quite clear that the N-word is a bad word, but it doesn't really matter. It's a stereotype, right? It treats the group as a homogenous group. Even the whole opposition bench says, we all stand up and say, I am the N-word, right? That is how people are primarily defined. That is something that's wrong. It says they have the same traits, the same desires, the same narrative, right? That's not true. They don't have the same narrative, and there's a distinction in that that doesn't need to be brought up over and over and over again by Waka Flocka Flame, right? But we'd say, honestly, it's mostly a negative stereotype. But before I do, go ahead.
If this word is so divisive, like you say, could you either name us an example of a black public figure who has denounced it, or show us why every black public figure insists on using it?
That is like the most false thing I've ever heard. Watch Prince of Bel-Air and Will Smith, for one, right? But second of all, plenty of intellectuals are against using it as well. That's just false to say everyone embraces it, right? You need more, like, culture. N-word is associated with people being, with African Americans being less intelligent, right? But being a lower social class and being something that's separate. That's what it's associated with, and that constant priming in people's mind that they are separate and defined by that identity is something that we disagree with, right? We'd say that there are two people this impacts. The first is it's how many white people are influenced by the constant use of this word, right? Not just the fact that of its description being used, but the fact that it's over and over and over again, that it seems that part of black culture, as Rennie wants to talk about, is the use of this word, right? So we'd say that that affects white people and their implicit bias. It's not just explicit racism, but it's that you can show there's a lot of implicit racism and a lot of uncomfortability with African Americans going forward, right? It's not about that white people don't have a right to be uncomfortable or have a right to be separated from that, but simply that we think it separates people, right? If you do studies where you give a white boss two resumes that are identical, right, and one has an African American name and one has a white name, they overwhelmingly choose the white name. We think that the less you define people by race, the less that'll be true, and the more it'll go forward for the African American cause, right? But the second group that's impacted by this is African American children, right? When we see that if you are a comedian, if you are someone who is successful, if you are Jay-Z, if you are Oprah, we think you have a responsibility to embrace that model, to embrace the fact that you are a role model for people, and not use that continually as your defining trait, right? Yes. Right? You can't go on to continually use that as your trait. We think you're setting up children to define themselves that way going forward. You think you're setting up children to define themselves by their oppression, right? And you think that you're socializing them to use a word that most people think makes them less intelligent and less able to deal. That's what most people think. It is a shame, but it's the reality of what's going on in society, right? But even if it's reclaimed, let's take them at their best. Even if it were a positive stereotype, we'd say that that's still bad, because it means that anyone that doesn't meet this criteria isn't truly black, right? Or isn't truly going forward, right? So we think even the stereotype that Asians are good at math, right, harms a lot of Asians who don't define math as their main academic subject, right? So we think that even if you were to turn it into a good thing, even if you were to reclaim it, that it means a specific black identity that's successful, that's a bad thing because it defines one black identity over and over again. The emotion that comes with the word, the impact that comes with the word, is the biggest harm to it, is defining everyone in the community as the same. And that is what we want to go against, and that is what we want to stop going forward. So what have we brought to you today, right? We've told you that this word in society is one that is inherently oppressive. But we've also told you that it's a constant reminder of stereotypes that doesn't lead to a society where we don't interact with each other primarily based on race. It reinforces the issues that we have that have already been brought up, of the fact that black women are defined as black women, but white women are defined as women, right? We say it's a bad stereotype that hurts them, but even if it were reclaimed, it would still be separating people in society. For those reasons, we are proud to propose.
I thank the speaker very much for his speech and call upon the first speaker from Cornell SR to open the case for closing argument.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I think that Nelson came up over here and tried to tell how he identifies with the N-word. And you know what? I'm going to use it because I don't think there's anything wrong. He told us why he considers himself to be a nigger and why he's proud of it. The other team came up here and painted only stories of victimhood, only stories of suffering, and nothing else. Symptomatic of their misunderstanding of how this community uses the word and their desperate desire to continue using those negative connotations and failing to appreciate the pride with which some members of this community actually wear this word. Let's begin with some refutation. What did Alex come up with? He said that this perpetuates stereotypes because African Americans actually have different narratives. We say we don't decide those narratives, right? If members of the African American community, especially prominent members of the African American community, decide that that word is important to them, decide that that is how they want to define the resurgence of that community, post everything that was done to them, we have no right to interfere. Furthermore, we argue that it's wrong to suggest that this word in any way is saying that everyone in this community is the same. It's sending a very clear message. It's saying some of us can sing rather well, some of us can rap rather well, some of us can be very funny sometimes, but we all have a very difficult history and we're proud of making it to where we've been. There's nothing homogeneous about the use of the word. And in this throw-in point, I'm sure it was designed to evoke some sentiment about children facing a hard time because Jay-Z now is using the word nigger. We say no. We say kids can now stand up to that idiotic schoolyard bully who threatens them and abuses them with the word nigger and tell them Jay-Z, who has a large net worth and is also very successful, uses it. There's nothing for me to be ashamed of, and this is why. I'm going to bring you a three-part extension. I'm going to tell you why there is absolutely no reason over here to interfere in this community's legitimate identity formation. Second, I'm going to tell you why specifically celebrities should be using this word. And last of all, what actually happens to this word when we send out the claim that you should not be using it. What really becomes of this word? First of all, identity formation. I think there's enough to say that members of the African American community, no thank you, and I don't have a condition for what you have to follow me. Why members of this community have legitimately actually embraced this word. Because let's understand that when Jay-Z actually uses this word, he's not opening up like a thesaurus or something and choosing this word as a synonym for African American. He's realizing the baggage that comes with it, and in spite of all of that, he's deciding to use it. This is a word that has an extremely rich history. I've seen speeches with Martin Luther King using this word in speeches to rally people in Washington, which they claim to be incredibly important, right? Leaders picked this word out during the fights for suffrage, during the fights for civil rights, and wore it for pride, and we think it's wrong to be interfering with this. Second point, why celebrities particularly should be using this word. We think that celebrities provide a unique opportunity to contrast the original derogatory meaning of the word and what it has actually come to mean. And we think that celebrities are in a unique position to do this in two regards. One, of course, within the community itself. We think for all the arguments that have actually been coming about in the debate, that they send a message to the community that this is what niggers actually are. Not what you think they are. But more importantly, they send a message to everyone outside of the community that this is what the community has now come to represent. Because everyone recognizes how hard it is to be a celebrity or a person of renown while coming from these communities due to nothing else but circumstances. They recognize that it's incredibly hard for these people to actually make it to where they are. And when these individuals, with the starkest contrast, right, all these things, I'll take back up in a moment, when all these individuals with their riches and with their fame actually use this word, it sends a very strong message. Go on.
When Marco Flanagan says, I go hard in the motherfucking paint N-word, what has he added to the deep intellectual talk about her needs, or is he simply used a word that separates them?
At worst, he is saying that the word doesn't mean anything bad, and we're happy to stand for that. At worst, he's saying, I can call myself a nigger and be okay with it, and not feel the crushing weight of being a plantation slave. We think that is worth it. Third argument, what happens to the word when you actually deny its existence, or when you try to remove it? You actually, by removing this word from discourse, implicitly send the message that this word is so bad, that it stands for something so disgusting, that it absolutely cannot be uttered. And we think that this is a ridiculous thing to actually be doing. In the same way that we think that actually banning discussion of the Holocaust, for instance, or on the worst excesses of Nazism and communism, for instance, are bad things to do, because we always want these words to remain in discourse. Moreover, no thank you, we want these words to be ridiculed in discourse. And this is important to understand, because we don't think that the black community should be asked to keep its history in a prison of negative connotations, while the renegade individual actually shouts across the street and tells them that they're a nigger in a derogatory fashion. Because recognize what this motion actually asks us to do is evaluate whether members of the African American community should or should not be doing something, right? The problem actually occurs when someone outside the community insults them, and when they are asked not to defend who they are and not to defend their pride in who they are. And we think that's the real problem, right? We think that by preventing negative interpretations from being ridiculed, which is a direct consequence of actually asking this word to be removed from discourse, you're allowing all those negative impacts to actually follow through. Ladies and gentlemen, we've provided you 3 clear reasons why it's an absolutely ridiculous idea to ask celebrities in the black community to reject the word nigger, to reject the word negro, or any other such loaded connotation word, right? We've told you there's a very legitimate battle for identity formation that's taking place. These individuals are not using those words lightly. We've told you that celebrities are in a unique position to provide the contrast that is needed, the blinding contrast that's needed to disprove any existing negative connotations. And last of all, we've told you, by removing that word from discourse, you send the idea that it's so taboo, it's so disgusting, that we just don't have the ability to engage with it. And we think it's a sorry opinion to express. And for all these reasons, I think all of us should be happy to have members of these communities using these words. Thank you.
I don't speak for a speaker to call upon the final speaker from Cornell Wide to conclude the case.
Madam Speaker, before I start my speech tonight, I want to quickly point out that the case that we heard today from side opposition has heard no impact whatsoever. Right? Like, we heard this discussion that we think like people align themselves by this cultural goal is essentially good, but they haven't told us why it's good. And Alex and I challenged them on that. Right? Like, are they, and maybe like I'm going to try to like make their argument this strong and kind of like hint at some of the things they might be suggesting. They might be suggesting that people are going to remember this oppression and therefore there's going to be less oppression. Maybe they're suggesting that these people are going to be discriminated less if they use this word and they ally themselves. We never heard that analysis. But what we have brought to you today, Madam Speaker, on our side, are significant third parties that are harmed. We're not only talking about black people that are harmed by negative stereotypes, but also by positive stereotypes. We have 3 points of crystallization. First of all, do we think that not using this word is losing something essential to the African American identity? That like somehow makes them less able to do well in society, whatever kind of good, this like ambiguous good that we have coming from side opposition. Secondly, we're going to talk about the harms of negative stereotypes, and the fact that it's often and generally used negatively. And lastly, we're going to talk about even when it's used in a way that's good, that's promoting the culture, we're saying that it's a stereotype and why that's bad. But before that, a few points of clash against Karen. First of all, this idea that, well, you know, the implicit message in all of this is that we're seeing well, and like we're exerting ourselves and that we're successful. Alex and I have 3 responses to this. Firstly, it's simply empirically untrue. Alex gave you a great POI. He said, even if you pass the logic test, we don't think that the phrase that he gave you in the song, I don't remember what it was, it's just like simply untrue that that's an intellectual discussion about African Americans in certain ways. Secondly, Mr. Speaker, these people don't use this, Madam Speaker, these people don't use like these because they think about it, they think about the social consequences. They use it because it sells, right? Because they get money for it and other people buy it. Why do they buy it, Madam Speaker? They buy it because they are satisfying these people's stereotype and these people's belief and buying into these people's constructs about who these people are. That is why it sells, and that's why Jay-Z uses it. I don't think Jay-Z thinks about like the social consequences of the songs that he writes.
Oh my God.
Lastly, this idea like, like if it's silenced, then it's really bad. First of all, Madam Speaker, we're not banning it. But secondly, we say that's an argument saying that like there's no part of any culture that can ever like progress and start slowly being removed. We think culture is ultimately transformative, and all we're arguing is that the African American culture should transform itself out of this particular. Okay, first question: are we losing a part of like what is essential to being like African American and Black that's so essentially bad? So this is a lot of the analysis that came out of opening our position. And there's a few problems with this. First of all, we argue, why is this good, right? Like, why is it good to remember your oppression? We never heard analysis about that. This has to be challenged, Madam Speaker, for a few reasons. First of all, because we believe that African Americans can accomplish the goal of unity, if that's what they're trying to go for, through other means that don't have to make them feel inferior to other individuals.
Right.
Secondly, maybe there's this implicit argument that there's going to be less oppression from other people as a result of this. But that's simply untrue, right? Like, I don't think that white people listen to the songs written by Jay-Z and come to the same conclusion that you do. All of the analysis coming from Nelson's speech believes that everyone is as educated as he is, and everyone reads the word to the same extent that he is. He doesn't recognize a lot of people simply take it at an implicit level and make these judgments and make these stereotypes and simply discriminate as opposed to making these intelligent decisions. Much more second crystallized. Okay. And ultimately, like, I think it was very damning in Tim's speech when he says, we don't want to get to a post-racial society. What do we mean by post-racial society, right? Alex and I are saying we just simply want less discrimination in the society, but we don't want everyone to be raised to be the first thing that you see and the first thing to judge people upon. We think that's the ultimate thing that's going to get the kind of goals that we want for African Americans. We think that's what's going to make them better off in the long run. Go ahead, Tim.
You know what happens with inferiority is because race is the first thing that you see. And if you're not allowed to address it, then you have to say, okay, we're going to talk as if you don't think that I'm inferior. Using the word nigger makes someone else uncomfortable, addresses inferiority.
So they're saying that like these words are like challenging people's inferiority complex, and they're now going to like feel more confident about it. But that's not, first of all, the way that it's used. But secondly, we think a lot of people that say, I want to get out of the stereotype. I don't want to be fundamentally identified as American. And when these artists use these words, they reinforce those stereotypes, and they force all African Americans to have to exist in this racial society. First of all, about negative stereotypes. We argue, first of all, as I told, that because it sells. That's important too. So because it sells, we argue that these people are not actually having this like intellectual discussion. But secondly, we argue that implicit bias is really bad. We argue that the kind of bias and discrimination in our society is not necessarily explicit discrimination, but the kind of like unconscious, internal, reflexive ideas that people have about other people of other races. What goes into these implicit beliefs? It is things like culture. It is things like music. It negatively affects white people, Madam Speaker, because for a lot of these white people, because they don't have African Americans within their community, their point of contact and access with African Americans is through music and is through culture. That's why this is particularly pernicious. But we also argue that there's a lot of youth that are going to be negatively affected by this. Alex gave you two kind of effects, right? We think that there's a modeling effect. That they see that the only kind of successful artists are the kind that are able to play, for instance, to the African culture. These are not people that are able to be successful on their own terms without identifying by their race. We also say there's a stereotype threat, right? Like it goes to their own eternal belief because it is an inherently derogatory word. It's a bad word, and that like they're less intelligent. But lastly, Madam Speaker, we think that the point of the word, of the N-word, isn't so much that it's a bad word, but the fact that it's a stereotype. And we have a problem with stereotypes. We're talking about third-party harms. I listed a few that I talked about earlier, because we think there's an additional one. There are people who simply don't want to be identified primarily as African Americans. They were forcing into this construct in our model. What do we mean by this, right? We're meaning that like when we say that all Asian people are good at math, that when like people buy into that stereotype, if I'm not good at math, they say, you don't meet my stereotype of a good Asian person is, and therefore I'm not going to hire you. Or you don't meet my prototype of what I see in people of your race. This is particularly pernicious. What this side of the house is doing is they're forcing African American, for people to identify if this is like a race social narrative, to say, oh, all African Americans are fighting against slavery. All African Americans have this coherent narrative that they want to fight against. And when these people go to job interviews, people who don't share these beliefs, and that comes out during the engagement process, they say, you don't meet my criteria for what a good African American man is, and I'm not going to hire you for that reason. This side of the House, Madam Speaker, gets us farther and farther away from a post-racial society we're so proud to propose.
I have the speaker for a speech and call for the final speaker from Cornell SR to review the case of the opposition to hold debate in this competition.
It's quite a pleasure giving the last speech of a tournament like this one. But I'm incredibly proud of the position that I've been asked to defend. I'm going to give you 3 points in my summary. First, do you have the right or even a normative claim upon artifacts of your culture under all circumstances? Kirat and I say unequivocally yes. Second, we're going to ask, what was the historical import of the word nigger? Why did Jay-Z decide that this was something good to use? Presumably there was something a little more meaningful than the fact that those 3 syllables sounded a little pleasant together. We said that these celebrities appeal to an important historical tradition, and that side has merely refused to clash with it. Finally, why celebrities should use this word, and why banning it negates the very important power that they gave it. First, what exactly do these artifacts of culture really do, and why do you have a claim upon expressing it? Nelson told an important story, right? He said the word nigger was a narrative of empowerment for him. First government, when they stood up in their next speech, said the reason why they didn't give him a POI is because the only narrative that it could tell was a narrative of victimhood. The only thing that they could do by using the word nigger was to subjugate Nelson. Alex's POI pretty much did exactly the same thing. He said, what intellectual conversation does whatever fling contribute to, right? What exactly does that phrase do except perhaps something silly? We reject fundamentally that proposition, that phrase, a word can only do one thing. We say it can do many things. We won't allow side government to hegemonize the meaning of that phrase. They ask, what sort of discourse does the phrase motherfucker, nigger, or whatever the motherfucker thing do? What sort of discourse does it start? To this, we say the kind of discourse that the 8 of us just had, ladies and gentlemen. That kind of discourse is important in society, and we think that there are enough important people within that society that continue to have that sort of discourse. We say it's important for that reason. If it is indeed true that the word can be nothing but derogatory, as second government was so insistent in addressing, then we think that the fact that these people, these celebrities, are so insistent on using it is precisely a symbol of the fact that it's so important to their culture. Ryan asks us, what impacts do we have? We say that expressing something that you deem to be important to your culture, even if it may be derogatory, is a perfect impact for why that culture is so constitutive of your identity. Second question, what was the historical impact of the word nigger? And this was something that went completely unaddressed. We don't think that Jay-Z is using this word simply because it sounds pleasant. It might sound pleasant to him, but we think another reason why he's using it is because the suffragists use it, because Wilma Carter used it, because people in the civil rights movement like MLK and Malcolm X used it, people in literature used it, people like James Baldwin and W.E.B. Du Bois used it. And he wanted to be part of that rich tradition of African Americans who did say, we want to step away from the mold you have created for us. They want to become part of a historical tradition, perhaps like a continuing part of historical tradition that has more swagger, but a historical tradition nonetheless that they continue to and that side of the house, they say all that history comes down to is a word that is inherently derogatory, that can inherently be used in a narrative of victimhood. We say, how dare they? That word has meaning, and it has meaning because of the history that underlies it. The history that says you are no longer a victim. You You are a person who can use the word exactly as Nelson used that word, as a symbol of his empowerment, as a symbol of him standing up in society, as a symbol of how Oprah uses it, a symbol of how 50 Cent uses it, a symbol of how Jay-Z uses it. We think that that sort of historical tradition and that sort of culture that celebrities appeal to makes it extremely important that they express it. Yes, Frank.
I also need to make a comment about what might be a more productive and interesting and useful way to use or not use a word. Why am I here debating? If every person has a sovereign right and I don't get to criticize or ever challenge their decisions, I have no point to be in this round.
Okay. You have the right to say, I don't think that word is doing you much service. The problem is, in order to do that successfully and to win this debate, what you needed to show was you can't possibly ever use it successfully. We say, in history, it has been used successfully. It has been used for empowerment. People like 50 Cent and Jay-Z and Waka Flynn are still doing it, and we are doing it on our side of the house. We are happy to say that yes, you can critically comment. That's why we're engaging you in this debate, but we say you have fundamentally done it wrongly. Last question. Why celebrities should use this sort of word and what does banning do to it? We say inside a community, celebrities serve as pillars of culture. What they fundamentally do is to serve as like beacons, as like guiding points for culture to say, this is what powerful people within the African American community, people who have succeeded, people who have like cast off, no, thank you, that narrative of victimhood and have moved on, look like. And they look perfectly like people who are comfortable with using that word nigger, of associating with that historical tradition of oppression, of associating with the narrative of victimhood, and moreover, of rejecting that narrative. We think that that's why inside that community, they are very important rallying points of culture, and we think that that's good. But moreover, outside of that community, we think they're important rallying points too. Ryan was quite flippant with this. The kid, supposedly, gets disregarded because the word nigger is out there. To this we had to say, first of all, that the kid in very many ways learns from the fact that 50 Cent, with his bulging muzzles, and like his persona and his manliness and all that sort of usual stuff, as well as the fact that your white friend in that classroom probably listens to 50 Cent's, what does he have, candy shop or whatever. We think that all that stuff shows that people outside that community, that 50 Cent and people from this African American culture can indeed like meaningfully constitute culture and cast off that connotation of disempowerment in a very important sense. They do indeed show people outside that culture that African Americans are no longer victims, are no longer disadvantaged, are no longer weak, as this side says they only can be. What does banning it do? And Ryan's only response to this is, we're not actually banning it. We say that when people get together in society and establish a strong norm that says you should not be using that word, that is almost tantamount to banning it. It is a cultural judgment. So what does this do? It devolves the stereotype from saying, perhaps a nigger can mean something more. Perhaps a nigger can mean something successful. Perhaps a nigger could mean something intelligent, as Nelson very well was, right? And when they take that power away, all they say is that this word is so bad, so fundamentally against your own interests, that the only thing it can potentially constitute by continuing to exist is derogation. That is what the side government has brought in our side house. We think that word has much more meaning. We think we bring that meaning, we make that meaning possible, and that is why I am so proud.